Well, I want to thank everybody for taking the opportunity to listen to my story and my family's story. I want everybody to know one thing, and that is I'm not a movie producer. I'm not a writer. I'm not a professional speaker. I do know the shoe business, and we wanted to call this. I'd like to call this Soul Survivor. I hope someday that some of my other relatives, as we go forward, maybe can make this into a book. That was my first thought, but worked on it for about a year, and it's I'm better off just to speak, to a camera and speak to the audience. So what I want to do is I want to thank a lot of people at the beginning here. I surely want to thank my uncle and my grandfather in 1932, who actually got us started. I think the world of them. I want to thank my father for 56 years, who in the 40s and up through the 80s, early 80s, ran this business, the shoe business in Nelsonville. I want to thank my brothers and sisters. I just couldn't be more proud of all of them, and they were all involved very much. I'm proud of a lot of things. One thing I'm proud of is, we still speak to each other. We still have Christmas together. We don't sue each other. And, that's something to be very proud of in today's society. We made a lot of mistakes going forward, but then we did a lot of good things. You'll hear me talk a lot about, I'll reflect back in sports. We had great coaches and great mentors while we were in Nelsonville, York. And one thing I always say is when I'd call back, when I was working, and I'd call back and I'd talk to my sisters and brothers, they picked up the phone. They told me the truth as they knew it. And each day we tried to get up the field. And once in a while we'd make a touchdown, and then once in a while we'd fumble. We don't do everything right, but all we tried to do was what our parents and my grandparents and my uncle wanted to do, and that is to make shoes, good quality shoes, and make them in Nelsonville, Ohio. And we've accomplished a lot of that. And like I say, I'm going to miss a lot of people. I'm going to miss a lot of names. Or people are going to look at this and say, gee, you didn't mention my dad, my uncle, my cousin. I apologize. But, over 80 years, I'm going to miss some. But I hope you enjoy this. I just do. Hope you enjoy it. And if you have any questions, please let us know. But who knows? Maybe this will end up being a movie. And if it does, then the money from that proceeds is going to go right back to Nelsonville. So thank you, folks, and hope you enjoy it.
Nelsonville, Ohio, founded by Daniel Nelson and his wife Sarah Smith Nelson, with the purchase of 200 acres of land on the banks of the Hocking River in August of 1814. Nelsonville is situated in the rugged but beautiful Appalachian Hills of southeastern Ohio in the Hocking River Valley. This area would later become known for its production of coal, brick, and also shoes.
Hi, I'm Stuart Brooks. I grew up in Nelsonville, Ohio, a town of about 5,000. And I'd like to tell you my story on how we got in the shoe business in southeastern Ohio. What you see here is part of the canal system that started at Lake Erie and made its way down to Newark, Ohio. From Newark, the canal traveled onto Buckeye Lake and then branched off. One branch, the Hocking Canal, headed down into southeastern Ohio. The other branch flowed on to Portsmouth, Ohio, where the canal emptied into the Great Ohio River. My ancestors traveled through these canal systems and these locks to get to southeastern Ohio. My great-great-grandfather and grandmother came through these canal locks back in the 1850s. Then my grandmother was born on that canal boat called the Custard. Her name was Hattie Stewart, and she would later marry Charles Hoodlet, or Charles Stewart Hoodlet. What I'm going to show you is just how our family started and how they got to southeastern Ohio. This is our story.
Only the hills, rock-ribbed and ancient as the sun, remained the same. All else changed. These words about describe Nelsonville as I knew it as a child, and as I know it now. Those hills are the same hills I knew as a child. Those are the same hills that seem to stand as a barrier and protection for Nelsonville. Those are the same hills that furnish fortune to great many men who have moved from Nelsonville, but their fortunes came from those hills.
Well, now we're on 33. We're in Nelsonville, Ohio. Basically, what you see here was the canal, and that's why for years, and it's always been called Canal Street. As you look over here, this was a canal lock. This was all dug out over to the actual Elks building, and boats were parked there. My great-grandmother's boat was parked there with other boats, and they stayed on there, they slept on there, they cooked on there, and then they would walk over towards Nelsonville and do their commerce, and buy what they needed and so on and so forth, and bring goods down to Nelsonville to sell. The interesting fact is that, as a reference, this used to be known as the old Dairy Queen lot. There was a Dairy Queen in Nelsonville there for many years, 50 years or so, and my great-grandparents owned that piece of land, and as they started to set some roots in the Nelsonville area, they started buying property. Now, my great-grandmother was a young child on that boat. We understand, somewhere around 8 months, she was a young child.
In order to tell something of Nelsonville as I remember it, it is necessary to tell something of my own life, because I was born here, and I lived my entire life here. I was born on February 21st, 1863, on a canal boat, in what was the Canal Basin, which would be the land between Hocking Street and Baird's Lot. Our boat, the Custer, had been tied up there for the winter. We were living on this boat when Morgan's cavalry entered Nelsonville on July 19th, 1863. The soldiers set fire to all the boats in the basin. My mother ran with me in her arms to my grandfather's shoe shop, which was on the square, about where Blime's lunchroom now stands. She got my father, and he came back and convinced the rebels that our boat was not a coal boat, but our home, and the fire was extinguished. The rebels looted stores, stole all of the horses that they could, and then finally got out of town. The Federal troops were in hot pursuit.
So as a reference, this being the Elks building, this is where my great-grandfather had his, I guess you would call it a store for everything. As he bought items coming from the canal, he sold items to people in Nelsonville and in Athens County. And then as he started to go forward, he opened up a blacksmith shop on the same site. And so as my grandmother became a young lady and married, she married Charles Stewart Hoodlet. So Charles Stewart Hoodlet, and then she became Hattie Hoodlet. So we'll talk about them as they grow up in Nelsonville. So now we're on the public square in Nelsonville, and again, this building behind me was my great-grandmother's and my great-grandfather's, which was Hoodlet's department store for over 80 years in this town. Men's, women's, children's. I personally worked there back in 67, 68, and for about 16 years with my grandfather. So many interesting pieces in that building. Back in the 20s, this whole square was just full of commerce and full of people, and they would stay open until midnight before the last trolley would leave town. And just my grandfather would tell me that there would be people just elbow to elbow walking up down these streets and buying, you know, products and so on and so forth. Of course, there's no TVs, there were no, you know, iPhones and so on and so forth. Yeah, no Walmarts, but this was, again, where she really started and started to, you know, build her life and build a life, you know, as we start to go forward. So, you know, a lot of interesting pieces. The Ohio coal mine, their offices were on the second floor for many, many, many years. The story goes that my grandmother, she did not believe in alcohol at all. My grandfather did, but she didn't. And so she would walk every evening down this street here, walk to her home, have a lunch, come back up somewhere around 8 o'clock, and then continue to work into that store. And the story goes that one time she came up here at night, looked up on the third floor and saw these lights, and they were lit up, and they were KKK on these lights up here. And she had come in, went up the other stairways up to this third floor that was at the time empty, and had a little peephole, and she opens this peephole, and there is the Ku Klux Klan meeting in her store. And she was upset because what the men would do was shop, let their wife shop in, you know, downstairs, upstairs, second floor, and then the men would kind of mosey up, and it was just a place for them to kind of hang out. I can remember on the walls it say charity, and it would say freedom, and so on and so forth. And my grandfather always told me this story, that when he goes in, a gentleman that we all dearly love, Chatty Woodson, Chatty put up his hood and said, "Mrs. Hoodlet, please don't make us break up." Said, "This is kind of where we hang out and have fun." And you got to understand that Chatty was black, and a great, great family, great family. So I'm just telling you what was passed down generations after generation. So we might have had the first black KKK member in Nelsonville, Ohio. Well, here we are. This is the home that our whole family pretty much grew up in. This was my great-grandmother, Hattie Hoodlet, home that she built with her husband, Charlie. And then my grandfather inherited this house in 1954 when Hattie passed. And then my parents and our family, we moved just down the street here up to this home and made this our permanent home. The shoe factory is about maybe 300 yards from here, and my dad would walk to work every day. Just like everybody else's home, some of the best memories in the world are right in this house as we grew up. We were only about 100 yards from our local high school back then. We were known as the Nelsonville Greyhounds, and my brothers and sisters, we were never late for school. But this home means so much to me. My sister Patricia, or T as we call her, lives in this home today. This is my sister Patricia. We all call her T, and this is my brother Jay. And both of them were, in the shoe business with William Brooks Shoe Company, and then we went on to be Rocky Shoes and Boots. Right behind me here is the home that my grandmother and grandfather lived, Stu Hoodlet and Marie Hoodlet. My mother was born in this home, Gloria, and you talk about great memories that live so close to your grandparents, all through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and early 80s. We were very fortunate that we had these folks beside us, and we got to grow up, right beside our grandparents, and having our parents right here in this particular home, it meant so much to us, and I think it really helped us as we become adults. So in 1932, my uncle and grandfather came down from Columbus, Ohio. They were working and running a couple of shoe factories, the H. Godman factory, I believe, in Columbus, Ohio. So they got a hold of a trade paper and found that there was a abandoned shoe factory in Nelsonville, Ohio, that was for lease. Back in those days, it was very common that a small town would build a building, and then they would try to bring in some type of industry into that town. So Nelsonville had this building in Nelsonville that at one time was a shoe factory, about 3 years, and they made World War I footwear at the time for about 3 years, and then it just didn't go any further. It was shut down. So some of the machinery was still in it. It was set up for a shoe factory, and my uncle and grandfather basically saw this, and they decided to come down and talk to the Nelsonville, at the time, I guess, city council, the city fathers, about maybe reopening this factory. Interesting thing, my uncle and grandfather and my grandmother, they came down to Nelsonville. Again, they were from Columbus, Ohio. I've told this story before. My grandmother said to my grandfather, "If this is Nelsonville, Ohio, I'm not staying here." You can imagine, 1932, coal industry, probably pretty rough area, and plus the clay mines were going pretty strong, and she just didn't think this was a place that she wanted to maybe raise a family. But they came down, they saw the factory, they made the agreement, and my uncle and grandfather started from day one and hired the first person as they started to build this factory. They hired each person to sew. They hired each person to make soles. They hired each person to start to make shoes and start to make manufacturing. I think the interesting part was that when my grandfather and uncle came down there, they came down in a brand new Oldsmobile that he had, and they got up that morning and somebody had stolen their car. And at that time, as we know, there was no such thing as taxis and Hertz rent-a-cars and so on. And so to get their car or get a transportation back to Columbus was not an easy task. But the interesting part of the story is about 6 months later, they found that car in New Straitsville, and they were running moonshine with it. So my grandmother said, "I still don't want to live here." But, looking back, the rest is history. That's how they got started. I have a picture here that kind of shows 1935, and it shows my uncle and my grandfather and so on. But here's my father right here on 33. He was 13 years old, working at the William Brooks Shoe Company. You can see at the time we probably had maybe a couple hundred employees at the time. I think it's interesting. The old canal was brick, what we know as the Canal Street today, and so that's the picture of 1935. I will mention that my father had a sister, Virginia, his only sister, and Virginia went to Ohio University and graduated, and then as my father, as the war started to ramp up in the late 40s, or in late 40s, in the late 30s, and in the early 40s, my Aunt Virginia, had become married, and then my father, of course, went on to war. This home behind me is where my parents, John and Glory, took up housekeeping. My father came out of the war, World War II, came back to Nelsonville, married my mother, and this was the first home. I was about 3 years old, and then we moved from this particular home up to my grandmother's house in about 54, 55. But all 5 of us were living here, and with my mother and father, and a lot of, again, not as many memories that I would have being very young, but it was the beginning of our family and the beginning of my father and mother starting their lives.
As the William Brooks Shoe Factory went into production, the Nelsonville area and the Hocking Valley in general were already producing coal and clay from numerous mining operations. That led to the production of brick and tile in Nelsonville and also in nearby Haydenville. In fact, a number of brick plants were in operation throughout southeastern Ohio. And the railroad had long since replaced the canal as a mover of people, products, and material to and from the area.
Bill Brooks sold the business in 1960. William Brooks Shoe sold the business in 1960 to Irving Drew Shoe Corporation in Lancaster, Ohio. And the shoe industry had already collapsed manufacturing-wise in the United States. When I said decline, as imports became more prevalent. So the business hadn't made money in a long period of time. And so Bill Brooks came to my father, Jack Wilson, the secretary, and Earl Steele, and said, "I've sold the business. The new owner said they'll keep all the management. That's the best I could do for you." So Irving Drew Shoe Corporation, owned by the Utleys and the Schuyler's, 2 family members in Lancaster, owned this business and ran it for 15 years, from 1960 to 1975. My father stayed here. He directed all of his children to get an education and move out of here. There was no future. So we all went different directions. So Dad ran this little company for them for 15 years with a lot of help from other people in the Nelsonville area. And in 1975, Utleys and the Schuyler's company hadn't made money in 3-4 years. They wanted to sell it. Well, it's hard to sell a business that hasn't made money. So the only offer they got was from my father. At that time, he was making $20,000 a year in 1975. He had no money, raised 5 children, lived conservatively, so he made him an offer of 50 cents on the dollar, and that offer was $640,000, which he didn't have, and he had no access to. So he gave him $500 cash to buy this business. Pam and I were living with 2 children in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and when he called me, I thought I heard he said he bought it. That's what I heard. So I went in the next day to my boss and said, who knew my father. It was a tanning. I traveled the United States and sold leather to these companies that were going out of business. So my boss wished me well, and Pam and I packed up and we headed to Nelsonville. So when I got here, Dad was not happy. I was not happy. I said something foolish like I was a pretty good salesman. So he said, if you think you're such a good salesman, go out and get me a loan for $640,000. So David Fredericks, who was the chief financial officer at the time, we went from Parkersburg to Columbus. Banks were polite, but they never bit. They never even got close. So, and this took months and months and months. The owners were they let us run the business. They let us run the day-to-day business, whatever we wanted to do. They didn't have another choice. So we were running it like it was ours, but it wasn't ours. We finally, Clarence Miller, a congressman from Lancaster, Ohio, wonderful, wonderful man. Well, I remember him well also. He said, well, you can get a Farmers Home Administration loan through the U.S. government. So we started down that path. And to make it real quick, once we had a guarantee, a 90% guarantee for that money from the U.S. government, we had banks lining up. So I think it was either 4 or 5 banks. So we met up at the First National Bank to close. They had never done one of these deals. There were stacks of paper that everybody had to sign. Sign personally, John and Gloria, Mike and Pam, anybody involved in the business, signed personally on the note. And everyone was scared to death. The lead bank was the People's Bank of Nelsonville. When I say that, percentage-wise, they put up the most money of the 5 banks. Vic Oakley walked in the bank there must have been 15 of us around the table, about 5 minutes late. This is what I remember. He walked in with a blue shiny suit, an old blue shiny suit, a white shirt that was kind of yellow, and a tie with a soup stain on it. He never sat down. He never brought an attorney. He pulled an envelope out of his pocket, threw it on the table, pointed at my dad, and I was in that meeting, and said, and David Frederick was, if Johnny Brooks says he'll pay me back, that's good enough for me. Threw the check down and walked out. Everybody just said, whew, this must be okay. So that's how we got started in 1975.
Daniel Nelson had laid out Nelsonville in 57 lots. Early on, he had designated one of those lots for use as a cemetery, now known as Fort Street Cemetery, another lot for a school, and a third lot in the middle of town for a public square.
Right behind me is the Presbyterian Church. It's where my mother and father were married, and John Lloyd Evans was here as our reverend for over 50 years. And he was so instrumental in our family unit. My grandparents, my father and my mother, my brothers and sisters, we grew up with all of our friends in this church. So right now we're sitting on the second floor of my dad's and my uncle and my grandfather's shoe factory, which at the time was called William Brooks Shoe Company. I'm going to kind of reminisce a little bit and talk about a lot of people that made a big difference in my life that worked here. I started in the summer of 1966. And I started working actually on the docks downstairs, loading and unloading trucks, materials coming in. My job was in the morning to go around to all of the people that worked on these 2 floors that made shoes and get what they needed for that day's production, such as shoelaces, glue, soles, anything, eyelets, anything you can think of, leather that would make a shoe or a boot. I'd go around in the morning, I would take their orders. Then in the afternoon, after I gathered them all up, and that was in the basement, we had a lot of the supplies that were stored on down the street here, which was the old brewery building. that they used to make beer in back in the early 1900s. Then in the afternoon, I would deliver these goods to all the people that were making shoes, and then they could go on and make their production. That was my first experience with jobs. And it really gave me an opportunity to meet everybody that worked in this factory. So I got to know a lot of these people very personally, and what I call, one-on-one. We would have times on Friday when they would have little meals. Each group might be downstairs where they box the shoes. They might have a little cookout, and you got to know everybody. So it was kind of unusual, young man my age, just turning 16, really get to know the people that work for my father. Some of these people I'm going to talk about, interesting people. There was a gentleman that worked here for many years, and he ran the old West End school building, which that's where they cut a lot of the soles for all the shoes back then, and it was very common to use the old school buildings for manufacturing. So we had the West End and the East End school, and then they had the middle school, but the West End school is where this gentleman worked for many years. His name was Skinny Gettle, and by his name, Skinny was a pretty skinny guy. And but Skinny's one of these guys that could do anything, could fix anything, fix any piece of equipment you could think of in this shoe factory. And I always remember him just kind of, I don't think he weighed 120 pounds, soaking wet. And I can see him still kind of bent over and, working on machines and getting production ready to go. So he was one of the characters that I got to know. I got to know a guy by the name of Chuck Shafer. And Chuck worked down on the first floor, and Chuck was in the department where they would package up the shoes and put them in boxes, and then ship them to our warehouse. And Chuck was another hard-working individual, and had a lot of dedication to my father. His wife also worked here for many years in the office, and we kind of grew up with the Shafer family. They lived just a block away from us. A gentleman by the name of Edgar Jones. Edgar Jones worked right on this floor I'm on right now. And Edgar, he ran part of the second floor. And Edgar also was a volunteer, he was I think a police officer at the time for Nelsonville and on the city council. There's another gentleman named of Carl Jung, and Carl worked on the first floor down below me here, and Carl ran the PVC department. Carl was very political in his life, did a great job for the Nelsonville community. He was on city council with my father, with Edgar Jones, for many years. Carl, I think, stepped in as mayor before for Nelsonville. Then a gentleman by the name of Martin Burley worked here. He just retired. Martin was, he had worked over 50 years for my father. There was 3 other people at the time that had 50 years or longer that worked for my dad in the shoe business. And Martin was just one of those guys that he came to work every day, and he just did what it took, to make this successful. A lot of people out in the Murray City area, out in Gloucester, out in what they call Pittsburgh Hollow, Logan, Ohio, surrounding areas, that work for my father. We had one pattern man. We had one guy upstairs was the only pattern man. Now I don't know. We have 6, 7 pattern people, maybe more. Mort Parrott was his name, and Mort was come out of the Navy, retired out of the Navy, I believe, and then went to work for my father upstairs, and just made patterns for shoes by hand. Today it's all electronic, it's done with laser, it's done on a computer, but Mort would cut these out and make a pattern for a new shoe. So, you look at this floor and it can tell a lot of stories. I wish it could talk, I really do. But this hole right here was a chute, and this chute, all the production that come off of this second floor then would go down here to be finished as full sets of shoes. So this is part of the floor, but yeah, that was put back in. That was a chute. And I remember, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of shoes have gone down that hole. This area we're sitting in right now, this was the lasting department. Basically, I can see these guys, the machines come right down the side of this wall, and this is where you take a shoe and you start to put it on the last, and you start to form that shoe around that particular last. And the last is very important. That gives you your correct sizing, whether you're 10 and a half wide, 12 medium, whatever size you are. So coming around this whole room was what they called the lasting department. And a gentleman named Joe Hall. Joe ran this particular area back here for many years for my father. And my father's office was just in the next building back here. And my dad would go in that office at 4 o'clock and take all of his messages and return calls. He would not return calls, would not take anybody's calls in this building when he was on the floor getting his production through here. That was his main interest, was to get as many pairs of shoes done in this factory and make sure he made his deliveries on time. That was his job. And he didn't have cell phones. He didn't have, he wasn't tweeting anybody. He wasn't, emailing anybody. The gal that did the parts for him wrote down who called. The only person he would take a call on would be if my mother would call him. And that wasn't a lot. If one of the kids or something he was wanted at home, we just lived a block away from here. And we were either over at our house, the school building's another just a half a block from here, or the swimming pool. That was our life. I don't want to leave out the ladies. Florence Forbes ran the third floor for many years for my father. Her husband worked downstairs on the equipment that actually you would trim off the soles of the excess soles on the shoes and so on. Very tough job, hard job, dirty job. And then Wilda Figgins, she ran the office for my father here, and the Figgins family is a well-known name in this whole community. My dad hired a young man named Bob Hollenbaugh. Bob came here in 72 or 3, I believe. Bob had grown up here. His Violet Hollenbaugh's son, Bob, had gone to the Marines after he graduated, I think, in 1960, and then came out of the Marines and came back to Nelsonville.
My name is Bob Hollenbaugh. I came out of the Marine Corps in 1970, and my good friend Mike Brooks was leaving town to take another job, and he offered me his job and talked his father into hiring me to start out working as a purchasing agent for the company. Mike had developed some revolutionary types of footwear, and our business took off because everybody wanted to see the new things that we were doing. We were using new materials, different types of soles. It was a pretty exciting time, and a lot of people out there, the marketing was coming from the hiking side. We were making boots for the military, police forces. So I was fortunate to be part of that whole process as I got into sales and marketing ended up with about 60 salesmen all over the country and all actually around the world. It was pretty exciting to be part of a team that was creating something out of a great company history that the Brooks has brought to Nelsonville and to Rocky.
With Bob Hollenball, Dave Fredericks, my brother Mike, and my dad, they built a really good bond, and those guys really got this factory back up on its feet. Shoe business was tough business. Shoe business is a tough business. The shoe business is a dirty business. It's most young kids don't want to go in and have leather all over them and have rubber soles, all over their body. I see these guys used to walk out of here, they have this rubber compound all over them. And, again, it's not air conditioned. It was tough. So we hated to see this factory not make shoes anymore, but we had to survive. And survive was we lost a lot of good working people. I'm sitting here telling you about so many people, so many families. But as the mines no longer operated and we're out of business, we lost a lot of good skilled labor. So we couldn't make enough shoes.
The hardest day of my life was having to stop making shoes here. I did everything I possibly could to try to keep that alive. In the last year that we were, and I'm blaming myself. We lost a lot of money, $5-6 million, and I was just trying to keep it going one more year. Right. But there was never an attempt, never, to sell this business. I'd had 3 majors that I knew that wanted to buy it. I was always polite to them, shook their hand, and told them no thank you. That was Wolverine, Timberland, and a company by the name of H.H. Brown that's currently owned by Warren Buffett. That would have moved everything out of Nelsonville. Right. And I just couldn't fathom that. And I felt we could build here. So there is a passion for Nelsonville. We've got smart people here, dedicated people here, just as well as any of those 3 big companies I mentioned to you. So, and I'm proud of, we started out when Dad bought the business, and it was about $2.5 million we were doing in sales annually. And today we'll be somewhere between $275 to $280 million. We have about 2,300 associates. We have a factory in Puerto Rico, run by a Nelsonville boy, Roger Schultz. Roger Schultz's grandfather Mielke Odenthal, worked for my grandfather. Roger Schultz's mother, Helen, worked for my father. Roger Schultz's brother and sister, Jim and Linda Schultz, worked for this company. And Roger's running our Puerto Rican operation, doing a super job.
Here we are at the Rocky Shoes and Boots Distribution Center, which is to my right. We are nestled in southeastern Ohio, about 60 miles southeast of Columbus. As you can see, the traffic pattern here, that's Route 33, goes through Nelsonville down to Athens, Ohio. We had this facility, we built it probably around 15 years ago. We house 1 million pairs of shoes. I'm going to take you inside and show you how this operation works. It's a state of the art. As you can see, we have a lot of shoes. We stack our shoes 40 feet in the air. This gives us a lot more room, and we have a lot more space to be able to utilize when we have big orders, especially for the military and especially for some of our bigger customers. But also, we can ship one pair at a time, and we have UPS, we have FedEx, we have trucking companies that will come in and they'll drop their shipments, and we'll load up, and then they'll take them out of here daily. So now we have a lot of shoes going through the system right now. We'll run, like I say, 2 shifts, but as you can see, we can move a lot of footwear, and we can take to our customers what their demands are on how quick they want it shipped, where they want it shipped to, do they want it invoiced to that particular customer through their names. It's all changed the way it used to be done back when my father was here, back in the 40s and the 50s. We're going to expand this particular warehouse sometime, I think, by next year, 2018, to try to meet all the new regulations that are coming our way. We ship all of our military out of here, all of our postal out of here, all of our work. So everything that Rocky produces comes in this warehouse and is shipped out of this warehouse.
Well, hi there. My name's Jason Brooks, and I understand my Uncle Stuart and my father Mike have been working on a little documentary about the company, Rocky Brands, in Nelsonville. So I wanted to say a few words about my feelings and commitment to the company and the community here in Nelsonville, Ohio. I'm actually the 4th generation CEO of the company. Just became the CEO in May of this year, and very proud to be here supporting the company and leading the company. But I was born and raised here in Nelsonville, Ohio, born in Lancaster, and lived here in Nelsonville my entire life. Went to Nelsonville Elementary School, the junior high school, the high schools. Played football and basketball and track here in Nelsonville. So I'm very passionate about the community, the surrounding areas, and what we have to offer here. I think Nelsonville is one of the best places in probably the U.S. to raise a family. They offer a lot of great things. We're pretty close to some pretty good sized cities. If you want to go get a little city atmosphere like Columbus or Pittsburgh or Cleveland or Cincinnati. But Nelsonville's got a really special place. And the fact that my great-grandfather and his brother started the company here in Nelsonville was really out of necessity. They had lost their jobs, as Stuart has probably told you, and needed to find work for no other reason than to just support their families. And so for me to have the opportunity to be here and lead this company into the next future of growth and opportunity is a tremendous opportunity for me. I take a lot of passion and pride into what they had to do to get here. I often think about how difficult it must have been for them and for my grandfather and really even my father. I don't have to worry about payroll. I don't have to worry about if the company is financially stable. We're in a really great place right now. What we need to do is find ways to grow the brands that we have, to support the surrounding community that we're a part of, really provide great jobs and opportunity for the people that work here and want to be here. So I just want to say thanks to everybody that's helped me get where I'm at. I want to thank my dad and my mom. Really proud of the Brooks family and what we've been able to accomplish here. But we couldn't have done it without a lot of great people and their support and efforts. So thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the video.